Good morning, everyone. We're here today to learn a little bit about the utility adjustment schedule for utility owners and how, as a utility owner, you need to complete that schedule and what's the purpose behind it. My name is Terry Brigman. I'm Senior Utility Coordinator for AMAC Foster Wheeler. Give you a little bit of background about myself so you know where I'm coming from with this training. I retired from the department a little over 3 years ago. After approximately 30 years of service, I started out in the urban design office as a design engineer for a little over 9 years. Then I worked in our engineering services office, facilitating field plan reviews for a little over 5 years. I then was a state bridge estimator for about 3 years before finding my niche in the world of utilities, and completed my career, the last 11 plus years of my career, in the Office of Utilities, retiring as the Assistant State Utilities Engineer. What I want to point out to you is the utility adjustment schedule that y'all all complete now, and why the department ask the questions they do and the information that's needed in completing that utility adjustment schedule, as well as some of the ramifications of and the importance of the utility adjustment schedule as it relates to the department's projects. Essentially give you a little history of where the department is today as it relates to the utility adjustment schedule. In roughly 2001, there essentially was a vision philosophy change in the department's Office of Utilities, and that new philosophy was in order to perform proper utility coordination on a project, was to perform that coordination from cradle to grave, or in other words, from concept through final acceptance. The FHWA had a process as far as coordinating on projects they called the 3 C's: communication, cooperation, and coordination. The Georgia Department of Transportation Utility Office added a 4th C: commitment. The reason behind that was we felt that without commitment from all the parties involved, the other 3 items really were not going to function properly. If you didn't have commitment from all the parties involved, then there really wasn't going to be clear communication, cooperation, or coordination as it relates to utility coordination on our projects. Part of how this all came about was in 2002, the Georgia Highway Contractors Association, or GHCA, raised concerns to the department's commissioner about utility delays on our DOT projects. Part of those concerns were that in order to get the construction completed on those projects in a timely fashion, was to minimize or eliminate utility delays. So they raised these issues to the commissioner at that time. Fast forward to 2005, the director of construction actually did a presentation before the department's board about utility delays on our construction projects. As a direct result of that presentation, the GDOT board issued an edict to the commissioner, who directed the state utilities engineer to create a utilities task force. That task force was created as a direct result of the contractor's concerns and the Office of Construction as it relates to utility delays on our construction projects. I'll get into a little bit more of that in greater detail later in this presentation. So one question a lot of people always ask: why are utilities on the right-of-way? Well, in a nutshell, the 23 CFR Part 645 Subpart B, which is a Code of Federal Regulations, states that it's in the public interest for utility facilities to be accommodated on the right-of-way of a federal aid project, as long as that location does not adversely affect the highway or create a safety issue. And I don't know, so that you all understand, the department gets the bulk of its funding for all projects from the federal government. So therefore, the federal government gets to set rules and guidelines as to how we utilize that funding in the construction of our projects. This is a handout of CFR 645 with a particular policy highlighted there about it being in the public interest for utilities to be on public right-of-way. Now, on the flip side, on the state side, OCGA 326171, which is the official code of Georgia annotated, essentially state law, also grants the department the authority to order the removal, relocation, or adjustment of utility facilities after giving proper notice, and to set relocation procedures, to direct utilities how they must operate when they're on the public right-of-way. This is a handout of the sections of state law, OCGA 326170 through 174, that address the direction with which the department operates as it relates to utilities being on public right-of-way, and how the department manages those facilities on public right-of-way. So again, the driving forces behind why we're here today is the commissioner and the highway contractors were of the mindset to move utilities faster, get them out of the way of construction. Again, the FHWA also, part of their policy is to avoid unnecessary utility relocations, or the FHWA may not pay for the funding on that project. What that statement means is, based on the FHWA guidelines, if they determine that the department did not do its due diligence and proper utility coordination, then they may withdraw funding from a particular project. The policy actually goes so as far as, if there's a systemic issue within a Department of Transportation, they may withhold funding from an entire construction work program. This obviously would be an extreme case, but it has happened on one project that I'm aware of. We did resolve the issue and resecured funding for that project. The other item on this slide, don't fix on construction what is possible to fix in pre-construction. All of us are aware that it's far more costly, not only in dollars, but in delay cost and so forth to the traveling public, to resolve issues on construction. And when we have a utility delay on construction, there's a lot of factors that go into what impact that utility delay creates. It's always more prudent and cheaper to fix an issue, resolve an issue in the pre-construction phase. And that's part of our intent with this revamping of the utility adjustment schedule, in order to secure the project schedule on the construction side. Now, in order to meet the board and the commissioner's direction, what the State Utility Office looked at, we basically analyzed and developed a strategy how to approach meeting their requirements, their requests. And looking at that, we looked at several factors. One thing, obviously, was third parties. There's nothing in state law that really held anybody responsible or accountable for utility delays on department projects. Since the utility office deals with utility owners, they're third parties. Therefore, they do not work for the department, and we have to create that partnership in order to get our projects completed successfully. So we had to look at what could we do legislatively to achieve that. The other item, our Utility Accommodations Policy and Standards Manual. Again, the FHWA requires every state DOT to develop a set of reasonable rules and regulations, or policies and procedures, P&P, in order to manage utilities on public right-of-way. The manual currently in place went into effect, I believe, January 2009. Prior to that, the last update had been 1988. So 20 plus years of the manual not having been updated. The other big undertaking was the department's policies and procedures. And what we had to look at was reviewing not only policies and procedures directly related to the utility office, but to other offices as well. And that included all policies and procedures as it relates to how the department develops, manages, and constructs a roadway project. That included from PFA, which is a project framework agreement, to PDP, plan development process, to construction specs. The PFA is a document that is entered into by the department and typically the local government over how to manage and pay for a DOT administered project. As it relates to the utility side of things, it would cover which party is responsible for utility coordination, as well as which party is responsible for reimbursable utilities cost, if there are any. The PDP is essentially the pre-construction Bible, if you will, on how to develop a project from a concept phase all the way up to construction letting. And of course, the construction specs are the guidelines as it relates to how a contractor, what he's responsible for, and how he is responsible for constructing a roadway project. Previously, there'd been nothing tying all these various documents and phases together. All told, we reviewed well over 100 policies and procedures, from not only from the Office of Utilities, but the Office of Construction, Preconstruction, Maintenance, Traffic Operations, etc., to ensure there were no conflicts and we captured all the items needed in order to achieve our goal of minimizing delays on DOT projects. Now, I mentioned the presentation the Director of Construction did with the GDOT board back in 2005. This pie chart is a representation of that presentation. It essentially shows the causes of delays as it relates to utilities on our construction projects. Essentially, the construction office sets this up in 4 categories: lack of project utility coordination, lack of resources, low priority, and other. The 2 items, lack of resources and low priority, are essentially items related directly to the utility industry and utility owners specifically. Lack of resources on the utility owner's part, where it be equipment, crews, etc., and performing work on DOT projects. Low priority. DOT projects are not capital projects for utility owners. So therefore they are not putting in a new line to achieve a new customer base to generate additional revenue. Therefore, DOT projects typically may be low priority as it relates to a utility owner and the crews and equipment he may put on those projects. Other is acts of God, weather, so forth, things that none of us have any control over. But the largest piece of this pie chart is lack of project utility coordination, typically in the pre-construction phase. That is the area that we felt we could do something about and that we need to concentrate our vision on as far as correcting and making changes to achieve acceptable results. Now, as I mentioned, the GDOT board and the commissioner basically initiated the creation of a utility task force in 2005. The first meeting of that utility task force occurred in August of 2005. I talked about legislatively holding folks accountable and potentially financially liable for delays on DOT projects. This is contained within Senate Bill 19 that was passed and signed into law in 2007. I'll get into that in greater detail, what Senate Bill 19 brings to the table. The Utility Accommodations Policy and Standards Manual, the current one, went into effect January 2009. As I mentioned earlier, that was the first update since 1988 and was a massive undertaking. It took several years to get all that in place. The internal GDOT policies and procedures, as I mentioned, we reviewed and modified dozens of those, including reviewing well over 100 of those to ensure there were no conflicts and to make changes to bring everything up to date. And of course, the current Utility Adjustment Schedule, or UAS form, that you all are familiar with now and what we're here for today to go over in greater detail. These are all items that we saw as a direct result of this presentation by the construction office and is represented by the pie chart here. What we needed to address and tackle in order to be successful. As I mentioned with the task force, it consists of all three parties involved in the department's projects. The Georgia DOT, Georgia Highway Contractors Association, or GHCA, and the Georgia Utilities Coordinating Council, or GUCC, which is made up of, its members contain folks from EMCs, other electric utilities, telecoms, cable, gas, local governments, etc. The GUCC is essentially the voice of the utility industry as far as the department's concerned in the state of Georgia. So all three parties have seats on this task force and have a voice in everything that we will discuss here today, and going forward how the department, and more specifically the Office of Utilities, manages and partners with the contractors and the utility owners in developing a successful program. As I mentioned, Senate Bill 19 went into effect in 2007. The four items that it really put into effect in state law that was not there before was, number one, the accountability. No more excuses. If there is a delay on a project, the purpose of the law is to determine what caused the delay, who is responsible for that delay, and therefore who should be held accountable and potentially financially liable for that delay. The PDP deadlines, as I mentioned earlier, the Preconstruction handbook, as far as it relates to utility relocation procedures, and the Utility Accommodations Manual, or UAM, there was nothing really tying the manual to the PDP deadlines. What we looked at was bringing that together and tying those milestones between the manual and the pre-construction phase of projects into one. The mediation rule. What the mediation rule does, it puts in place a process for handling utility delays on construction. It also allows for handling delays as it relates to a utility adjustment schedule in the pre-construction phase, and I'll discuss each of those in greater detail a little bit later. The other item that the law put in place was the public interest determination, or PID as you may have heard it called, identifier for a department's project. This was a huge change for the state of Georgia. And what it did was put in place the authority for the department to fund utility relocation costs as long as the utility owner agrees to include those relocations in our roadway contract and that project has been identified as a PID. Now our P3 project and our design build projects automatically qualify for a PID determination. Other projects during various milestones, field plan reviews, etc., are reviewed by multiple parties within the department, and depending on the complexity and the potential risk for delays as it relates to the utilities involved on the project, a project may be valued as a PID. In other words, it would be less risky for the department to fund the utility relocations if they're included in the contract than to let the project and have the utilities do the relocations on their own and risk potential delays to the construction and completion of that project. I'll discuss each of these in greater detail as we go through this today. Okay, the utility adjustment schedule essentially consists of 4 sections. Section A is the summary of the existing utility facilities and the utility adjustment schedule. Section B is the special requirements. Section C is the work plan. And Section D is the schedule summary for the various work phases of the work plan. I'll go through each of these in greater detail also. Now the utility adjustment schedule, Section A and B, is what's represented on this slide, but the schedule as a whole is requested by the district utility engineer. It is submitted by the utility owner to the district utility office. That schedule is then reviewed, and if deemed acceptable and approved by the district utility office, it will be forwarded to the project manager for submittal to the construction bidding administration office and to the district estimator. The reason for this, if it goes to the construction bidding administration office, part of the change the department put in place in the last several years is that executed utility adjustment schedules are provided as part of the bid review, plan review package for bid advertisement for the contractors to have the utility adjustment schedules in hand before they ever submit a bid on a department's project. Those UASs are included as part of that plan bid advertisement package by the Office of Construction Bidding Administration. It goes to the district estimator for them to use in developing the overall project contract time. And if the utilities adversely affect the expected contract time, then there's coordination efforts there to adjust the contract time in accordance with the submitted utility adjustment schedules. The district utility office will then upload the approved and signed utility adjustment schedule to ProjectWise, which is internal storage essentially for all projects for various department offices to store project documents on. as well as to Primavera P6 utility module, which went into effect March 2016 letting. What that does, the district utility office will upload the various UASs, depending on how many are on any given project, into P6, and that helps us identify what the appropriate utility relocation schedule should be as it relates to all the utilities involved on that project. And by the way, the UAS is not signed per se anymore. It's performed within GUPS, but once you as a utility owner submits that GUPS permit and UAS within the GUPS system to the district for review, that is considered your signature at that time. Section C is the detailed work plan. Essentially, this is where you lay out how you plan on doing your relocation work, as well as the time frame you expect each phase of that work to occur. I'll discuss each of these sections of the UAS in greater detail here in a moment. Section D is basically the summary for the work plan. It identifies the various work phases. We have 9 work phases that are on the utility adjustment schedule. The bulk of that work will be identified within each of the various phases. Every project will not necessarily have something in each phase, but you identify the work that you plan on doing within the appropriate phase, and I will explain what the department expects for each phase to contain here in a minute. So, Section A. Section A, if you look at, essentially says summary of utility facilities and utility adjustment schedule. If you notice, the next line says list all existing facilities within the project, exclude minor items. And it says provide quantity, type of facility, and type of service provided. Then you have quantity and conflict column and units. Of course, the units is a selectable box within GUPS, so it would be linear foot each, whatever the specific unit may be for any given item. All major existing facilities should be identified here. When we say exclude minor items, what we're referring to is items similar to water valves, gas valves, individual meters, pull boxes, switches, transformers, etc. Now I want to qualify that with saying that in the utility world there's a whole lot of gray and very little black and white. So on any given project, what may be minor on one project may not be minor on the next project. For example, if you've got an intersection improvement project that has multiple water valves in the roadway, those probably need to be identified, versus a 5 to 10 mile project that may have a handful of water valves divided out over the length of the project, may not be as critical to that project's schedule or create a risk to the schedule, therefore could be considered a minor item. So some engineering judgment needs to be used here, as well as if you have any questions, discuss those concerns with the district utility office to determine what, if anything, should be included or excluded at this location. Now, one item that we see often on the quantity and type of facility and service provided is the quantity and conflict will be identified, as well as the type of facility and type of service provided, however, not the total quantity. What we're actually looking for in this first section is the total quantity within the limits of that project, as well as the type of facility, type of service, and the quantity and conflict. I have examples of these a little bit later, but let me say this now. If you have 1,000 feet of pipe and only 2,000 feet in conflict, then the UAS should show 1,000 feet of pipe, whatever type, whatever service, and then 250 feet would be the quantity in conflict. So it should show the total amount within the limits of the project. Now, if you do have facilities that run off the project that are impacted by the project, you do not have to include those here. We're looking for projects within the specific limits of the DOT project. And what that does is help us analyze and determine the potential risk for additional utility conflicts and therefore delays if those facilities are impacted by construction at some point in time. So, if you look at the next line, it says existing facility locations were identified using, and it says drop-down menu dated. That drop-down menu consists of essentially 4 items. As-built survey record, record information only, subsurface investigation or SUE, or records and maps and field reviews. So what you're identifying at that location is how did you identify those existing facilities? How were they identified? Did you, obviously, the highest level of location would be the as-built survey records. Did you use as-built plans? And then you identify whatever set of plans or however you identified those existing facilities, what was the date given on those plans or the field review was done and so forth. The next line, this schedule is based on, and again, a drop-down menu dated. That item consists of 4 types of plans: preliminary plans, final plans, revised plans, or concept plans. Essentially what you're doing here is identifying the plans and the date of those plans that this schedule was based on. And that's critical. And the reason that is so critical is if there is a change at a later date, then you may have the opportunity under state law and the manual, Utility Accommodations Manual, to review those changes and possibly revise this schedule. Now, most of the time, the schedule will essentially be based on preliminary plans. And the reason for that is the department holds a final field plan review approximately 6 months prior to a project letting. Certification for funding for any DOT project has to occur 11 weeks prior to the department's letting. Therefore, the GUPS permit, the utility adjustment schedule, your relocation plans all have to be submitted to the department months in advance of a letting. Therefore, preliminary plans. Now, there are significant changes to those plans as the project continues to develop. Through coordination efforts with the district, you'll have a chance to review that and possibly make modifications. But most of the time you will be basing this schedule off preliminary plans. The department considers final plans at the stage when the project manager submits those plans to the Construction Bidding Administration Office just prior to a letting. Those are the plans that are sent out for advertisement for the contractors to review and bid on. Now, as a utility owner, once you receive these final plans, do not just ignore them. You need to review those plans in conjunction with the plans that you base this schedule on and ensure that there's no changes that may have impacted your adjustment schedule. If there are changes that occurred that may have impacted your schedule, you need to coordinate immediately with the district utility office to address that concern and resolve that issue prior to us letting the project. And of course, then we would have revised plans if the final plans had changes made to them. That typically would be after that submittal date, as I mentioned, by the project manager, or even on construction. Now, as I mentioned, that date should typically not change unless there's been a change to the plans that has impacted your utility facilities. And I'll discuss that in greater detail as we go on this morning as well. Now, one thing I want to point out at the bottom of Section A is the signature lines. I know they look pretty mundane, but if you notice, the first one says prepared by utility representative, and then title, phone, and date. Keep in mind how important that line is, because once you sign this line this document as a utility owner and date it and submit that to the district utility office, and again, they won't be a physical signature, it'll be through the GUPS submittal, then the department is going to review this schedule, and if deemed acceptable, we will approve it, and we then have a fully executed utility adjustment schedule. And anything contained within this schedule, the department expectations will be that you can relocate or adjust your facilities in accordance with this schedule and in the time frame given. If you're unable to do that, then that's where Senate Bill 19 comes into play with the accountability and potential liability. So keep that in mind. When you submit this schedule, ensure that it's something that you're prepared to live with. And then at the bottom, as I mentioned, the department will approve it. And at that point, we have a completed, fully executed utility adjustment schedule. Now, Section B of the utility adjustment schedule is special requirements. Essentially, the intent of this section is crucial to identify dependent activities. The intent here, as you notice, it says staging required, dependent activities, joint use coordination, etc., or none, if you don't have any special requirements. The items that you should be identifying under Section B should be a brief explanation of any required staging, dependent activities, joint use coordination, operational constraints, seasonal limitations, etc., that may impact the relocation and or adjustment of your facilities. Seasonal restrictions are something that we're mostly all familiar with as it relates to electric transmission facilities. This time of year, roughly May to October, we know we can't take electric transmission facilities out of service due to the high demands of the air conditioning summer season. On the flip side, gas pipelines, transmission facilities, typically in the winter, from December, January up through March, typically cannot be taken out of service. Anything of that nature is what we're looking for in this Section B. What type of restrictions impact when you can actually work on your facilities? Are they contractual obligations? In other words, identified shutdown periods with some of your customers, maybe an industrial park, or a large business that you're providing service to may have there may be something in the contract that requires a certain day's notice, certain periods of time when you can shut down or not. Those type of things need to be identified in Section B. Construction considerations, grading, clearing, utility sequence of operations. Maybe you are having to do your own staging / sequence of operations to facilitate your relocation work. The roadway staging, right-of-way staking, etc. Anything that you need the contractor to do in order for you to adequately perform your relocation and adjustments, any of those expectations need to be identified here and reviewed with the district utility office. Are there regulatory restraints? Various restrictions based on other regulatory requirements, be it whether it's federally, state, or even local government. Something we see here on occasion is maybe there's noise ordinances by a local government. And if you had intentions of doing your relocation work, say at nighttime when these noise ordinances did not allow such work, those are things you need to identify here and make sure that you've captured in this adjustment schedule. Any dependent restrictions such as joint use requirements. If you're a joint use attachee on a pole owner, obviously until the new poles are in place, you can't do your attachments and all. You need to properly identify that here, that you're dependent on another utility to complete some work before you can begin. Are there special easement requirements, condemnations, or permits? Anything of those nature that's required for you to obtain in order to perform your relocations or adjustments, you need to properly identify here in order to ensure that you're not having time count against you when you really can't perform work based on these type of items. As we mentioned, electric transmission, that's pretty common. There may be some other utilities that have other seasonal type restrictions. Those type of things need to be accounted for. Again, all of these examples and all are not all inclusive, and they're not exclusive. So these are examples to give you some idea of what the department is looking for and what the department needs to know in order to understand your adjustment schedule. Keep in mind with this adjustment schedule, what you're trying to do is convey to the department, a third party, and to the contractor, what your intention is as far as the relocation and or adjustment of your facilities in order to minimize impacts to the project schedule. So anything of that nature needs to be identified here. We mentioned a 10-day notice there for an interruption to a service, to a facility. If you have joint use concrete poles that have a long lead time, that kind of work needs to be identified. Those types of things are what we're looking for here under Section B, special requirements. Anything of the nature that may impact your ability to perform your work. Now, one thing we want to bring up in the special requirements, some things that we see when reviewing these schedules, and just to make you aware that if we see this type of language, it's probably going to raise a red flag to the district utility office, and they're going to be seeking additional clarification and or justification for why this is appropriate on this schedule. The words all are entire, particularly on larger projects. If you recall, I mentioned earlier, there's not a lot of black and white in utilities, there's a whole lot of gray. This is one of those areas. But when we see language such as entire project, right-of-way staking must be completed, or entire project must have clearing completed or grading prior to beginning any work. That type of language, particularly on a larger project, is going to raise some questions. And again, it may be something as simple as additional clarification to resolve it. However, just to make you aware that it will be something that will probably be questioned. Grading has to be within 2 feet of final grade. Now, if we have a large grade change on a project, 10, 12, 15 feet, that may be something that's reasonable to get some grading down, to cut a hill down, or if we're doing embankment fill, particularly for underground or even for pole owners, obviously, in order to achieve a reasonable location on those final facility locations. However, if the grading request is something to simply minimize an additional depth on a manhole or something, depending again on the scope of the project and the nature of the specific project, that may or may not be something that's acceptable. If that causes a potential delay to that project as deemed by the district utility office, they may ask you to go ahead and complete that work, even with an additional depth structure or something, in order to be out of the contractor's way. Again, just keep that in mind. It may need additional clarification. When we see some language such as no work can begin on joint use poles until entire pole line relocation is completed by a pole owner. Or the next line, all other attachees must be in place and energized before AT&T attachments can be made and cut over. These are just examples that we've seen on utility adjustment schedules that raise questions. And depending on the scope of the project and the scale, if we're talking 5 or 6 poles, this may be perfectly acceptable. If we're talking 20, 40, 50 poles plus, then it's probably going to be hard to understand why there's not some work that can be done somewhere else while you're waiting on a pole line to be completed or put in place. So just keep in mind, it's just going to raise questions. It's not saying it's completely incorrect, but there will be questions asked of that. Now, Section C. Section C is basically the detailed work plan of how you plan on doing your relocation work and how long you plan on that taking. So you notice column 21 says location. Please identify by stations, location numbers, or sheet numbers. Keep in mind that information must correlate to GDOT's roadway plans. In other words, the station numbers should identify with the GDOT roadway project station numbers. Location numbers can be like pole numbers and so forth, as long as they are contained on plans that can be correlated to the stations, correct station locations and so forth, or GDOT's actual roadway sheet numbers. What we've seen in the past at times is where a utility owner has taken a set of plans and redone cut sheets and created a whole completely separate type of layout that is not really correlated to the roadway plans. This is something that would be unacceptable. These locations need to be easily identified on the DOT roadway plans. The description of the work in column 22 is essentially just that, a description, brief description of the relocation and or adjustment work or dependent activity that you're waiting on in order to perform a particular phase of work. Now, column 23 identifies that dependent activity more specifically, whereas column 22 would be just a brief explanation of it, if necessary. That may not always be necessary. But 23, you should identify dependent activities as also identified in Section B, special requirements. Anything identified in Section B should also be identified on the work plan Section C here. Now, column 24 is the GDOT plan stage number. What that refers to is the actual stage number of GDOT's plans. In other words, if the department's project plans have multiple stages, then that stage should correlate with those staging, not any sequence of operation or utility staging that you're performing. And then, of course, column 25 is the total estimated days for that various section of work to be completed. Column 26 and 27 consist of the average number of workers you plan on putting on that various section of work and what day number you expect that work to begin in column 27. Now what I want to point out with the red text in column 25 and then the new columns 26 and 27, those are some changes that have been made by a utility liaison committee, which includes the utility owners, to better identify the hard copy utility adjustment schedule with the version that is now in GUTS. That's all that signifies. There's nothing beyond that for you to be concerned with. Now, one thing that should be mentioned here, the intent of this detailed work plan is for you to accurately identify the utility sequence of operations, if any, and its relationship to the GDOT plans, including GDOT staging, if applicable. That is addressed in the Utility Accommodations Manual, section 41C1B. And that needs to be identified on this detailed work plan. If you do have utility sequence of operations and you can't do your work in a linear pattern, maybe you have temporary facilities you need to install to accommodate the relocation work and so forth, that should be accounted for here. You should coordinate with the district utilities office to ensure that your relocation work fits with the constructability of the department's project. If you have any questions concerning that, use that district office as a resource to help you understand the department's intent with the construction of that project and how your relocation work would best fit in with that. Now, one thing I also want to point out on this slide, the next to the last bullet, coordinate with other utilities as required, Utility Accommodations Manual, section 41C1D. One thing that's important for you to understand as a utility owner is why it is the department's responsibility to coordinate the utility relocation work on a department project. It is also your responsibility as a utility owner when you are on public right-of-way to coordinate with the department as well as with other utilities as required in order to facilitate the letting and construction of a department project. That's what that section of the manual addresses. And again, if you are on public right-of-way in the state of Georgia, then you have a responsibility in order to be on public right-of-way to help accommodate those projects, whether it's on an on-system route or even an off-system route that the department is administering the construction of that project. And as I mentioned, anything here in the section C must accurately reflect special requirements in section B. Now this is a handout of 41C1B, which addresses making sure that your facilities accommodate the construction of the project, and that if there's any staging needed for your work to accommodate that work, then that should be identified by you as the utility owner. And then 41C1D, which addresses the responsibility to coordinate with any other impacted utility facilities so that no foreseeable conflicts are shown. So there is a responsibility not only on the department but on utility owners to address any conflicts on a department project and to help coordinate and resolve those conflicts. Again, similar to section B, special requirements, these are some red flag notes. If we see these on the detailed work plan, that would probably raise a question, and we would seek additional clarification and or justification. Essentially, this is the same, the words all or entire, as it relates to any form of work. Or that all work on joint use poles, the poles must be completed before any work can begin. That type of information. Again, if we have a small project with a handful of poles, that may not be an issue. But if we have a project with a large number of poles, the department will probably expect that you could perform some work in phases to help accommodate the schedule of the DOT project. Now, Section D is a schedule summary for the work plan to identify the various phases that each work is addressed in. Section D should accurately summarize the various phases of your utility relocation work. If you notice there, it says exclude weekends, weather delays, and non-productive time. Essentially, the department's specifications account for those items as far as contract time. Therefore, we ask that you not include that when you're creating your utility adjustment schedule. What we're seeking is just the actual number of work days needed for you to perform the relocation work identified and in the time period you feel is necessary in order to complete that relocation and or adjustment work. Just the actual work days. Now, if you notice in columns 33 and 34, you'll see it says prior to utility NTP and after utility NTP. And utility NTP is red there. That also is a change made by the Utility Liaison Committee. That used to say project award, prior to project award, after project award. We felt utility NTP or notice to proceed was more appropriate given how we do issue some notice to proceed prior to award of a project. Now, this change will not occur immediately in GUPS. It's going to take a period of time. So for now, you'll still see that on your GUPS printout, the project award, but essentially in the future, it will change to utility NTP to more accurately reflect how we provide notices to utility owners for their relocation work. And I'm going to go over each of these work phases in greater detail also as far as what the department expects to make up these. And again, it's not set in stone, but it's just to give you an idea. And of course, then the project duration for non-concurrent activities and days. In other words, how long is it going to take you to perform this work? That's essentially what all this will total up to in the end. Now, the utility NTP typically would be day one. We used to tell you to use day 0, but we've recently learned that GUPS does not allow for zeros. So it would be day 1. So when you get your notice to proceed for any phase of the work, that essentially would be your day 1 as far as the physical relocation or whatever the work may be that notice to proceed addressed. Therefore, PE work or preliminary engineering typically would be a negative number. This work should be occurring prior to the letting of a project, any physical relocation. That work is essentially the notice to proceed for preliminary engineering essentially begins when you get your first correspondence from the department, back at the concept stage or whenever it may occur, but that first correspondence from the department requesting a deliverable from you or a review of a potential department project and a review of potential existing facilities within the limits of that project. That is your notice at that time for preliminary engineering work. So that's why typically it would be a negative number. It's occurred well in the past and may occur up and including up to the award of the project. Now this here is an example of a utility adjustment schedule of Section A here. It just shows you, kind of illustrates what I was talking about as far as identifying the quantity and type of facility and type of service. You notice the first line says 1 50-3 AT&T pole on east side of Chattooga Road across from Mitchell Road. And it shows quantity and conflict 1. The next line you notice says 4,000 feet of miscellaneous buried fiber and copper cables of various sizes. Quantity and conflict 90. So even though there's 4,000 feet within the limits of the project, there's only 90 in conflict. Now the next line says 6,500 feet of miscellaneous aerial fiber and copper cables of various sizes, and quantity in conflict is actually 0. So again, they've identified that they've got 6,500 feet of aerial facilities, but actually 0 is in conflict. But this is what we want to see in this section A. We want you to identify any facilities you have within the limits of this project. And as you notice here, one of the questions that was raised, if you have buried or aerial facilities, they should be broken out separately, just as has been done on this example. And then if you notice under special requirements down there, it says Georgia Power Company must relocate 8 new poles before AT&T can begin work to place 8 new overhead guys and anchors. Now this goes back to what I've discussed earlier about all the facilities must be this or that before work can be performed. Obviously the poles must be in place, the new poles, before an overhead guy can be in place. And for this scale of project, and I'm not familiar with it, again, this may not be an issue. But if there were more poles involved, then the question probably would be raised as to, can you not guy some of the poles coming behind Georgia Power as they complete their pole installation, and you do part of the work while they're performing and just follow along behind them. Those are questions that would probably be asked. And if not, then additional justification would be needed as to why that could not occur. But for this size of project with only 8 poles here, it may not adversely affect the project schedule, so this may not be an issue. But it may be something that's just questioned and you need to clarify. Now this is the work plan, the detailed work plan for this project. If you notice preliminary engineering, it shows 7 days, 1 worker, and of course this project may not have staging plans. It shows all stages 1. And again, keep in mind, if the DOT project has staging plans and you're doing work in, say, stage 1 and then maybe stage 3, that work during each of those stages should be accurately reflected in this work plan. But in this case, everything's occurring in stage 1, and of course everything happens and there are no staging plans, then that's stage 1 anyway. You notice here construction engineering, they say receipt of final plans on FTP site, and then material procurement, and they've identified as dependent activities. Notice to proceed, construction engineering complete. Now in the construction phase, they identify station 97 plus 00 to 97 plus 90 on the right. It says bury 90 feet of buried 50 pair copper cable. And they list dependent activities that must occur in order for them to complete that work. Stage 1, number of days it's going to take to complete that work, 7. Average number of workers they plan on putting on that, 2. And then the next phase of work, they've got place 8 overhead guys, 8 down guys, and 8 anchors to new Georgia Power poles being relocated. And you notice, just like they identified in section B, special requirements, a dependent activity is Georgia Power Company placing 8 new poles. Again, for this project that may not be an issue. If it was more poles, there probably would be a question as to why you couldn't do the work, part of the work as Georgia Power completed their pole installation. It would just be a question and some clarification needed. And they go in and identify splicing or tie-in work, and then service considerations. I mentioned about the special requirements, potentially have a service consideration. This is where they've properly identified even in their detailed work plan. And this should have been reflected in section B as well, the special requirements. But it says cut over 2 special circuits to new cable to be arranged with customer after normal business hours. These are circuits at building to entrance gate at Fort Benning. So this is on a military base, and they can have to do the work after normal business hours. This item should have also been identified in section B as well, but at least it was captured here to show that they have a period of time to account for when they must make arrangements to perform this final splicing. And then if you see on section D, the summary for the work plan, it shows preliminary engineering, total days 7 and prior to project award, which now would be prior to utility NTP, but it says 7, which would be normal expectations. And then construction engineering is 30 days, and it's after project award, it ends at 31, which would be day 1 plus the 30 days is 31, and so forth, for a total of 132 days of non-concurrent activities needed in order to complete this work. Now, the next example is one that shows some things that are maybe not quite as complete. If you notice under section A, list of all existing facilities within the project, they say 350 pair buried copper cable, quantity and conflict 2100 linear feet. The next line says 900 pair buried copper cable, quantity and conflict 600 feet. So by this example, we don't know, is there 5,000 feet of buried copper cable on the project with 2,100 feet in conflict, or is it just 2,100 feet? This is an example of where the total existing quantity was not completed correctly. An additional request may be made for this to be properly filled out. So that illustrates what I was speaking of in showing the total quantity within the limits of the project as well as the quantity within conflict. Now if you notice on the special requirements section B note, it says Georgia Power, Cable TV, and ATMS have transferred off old poles onto new poles and all cutover has been completed. Then AT&T can perform their work. Now, keep in mind, I mentioned earlier, when you submit these utility adjustment schedules, you're submitting it to a third party, the department, and also for the contractor to eventually have, once it's been approved, to review and understand what your work plan is. If you read this verbatim, and you can't really read between the lines, it says essentially that until all of that other work by those 3 parties have been done, AT&T cannot do any work. That needs a little additional clarification. That's something that's going to be questioned, and some additional coordination will be needed to understand what the intent is here. Now, if you go over to their detailed work plan, you'll see that they identify on their preliminary engineering, review final plans and power company laydowns, review final field drawings, review and verify road contractor has any revisions to the plans. So dependent activity is need final plans from Georgia Power. Since they're an attachee, obviously they need to know where the Georgia Power, the pole owner poles are going to be. But that is being completed after Georgia Power has done their work. Now, that's showing in preliminary engineering, and I'm going to discuss that here in a minute in section D, but there should have been some level of preliminary engineering that could have occurred prior to this. And then you notice to go on down and identify construction engineering, material procurement, and then construction. And you'll notice again, under description of work, it says place all aerial copper cables or place all buried copper cables, but dependent activities is the same as the note under section B, special requirements, that must be completely transferred and cut over before AT&T can begin. So they're saying again, they cannot do any work at all, physical construction, until all that's completed. That may or may not be acceptable. It just may require some additional discussion. That's my primary point here with that type of information. And then you'll see they identified splicing or tie-in work, service considerations, and then of course temporary work. Now what I wanted to point out on this example on section D, schedule summary, that I referenced in C, the detailed work plan, if you notice the preliminary engineering, they show total estimated days 30, but they don't show any prior to project award. It's all after the project's been awarded. That's probably something that's going to be questioned, because there should be some level of preliminary engineering that's occurred prior to that project award. And then as the part afterwards, should that have been included in construction engineering or not? That's just something that needs to be discussed and coordinated with the district utility office so we can be sure that we're all on the same page. Okay, utility adjustment schedule definitions. What we did when we completed the hard copy utility adjustment schedule, that came directly out of the utility task force that I've mentioned earlier today, being created at the behest of the GDOT board and the commissioner. And that's one thing I think it's important for everyone to understand that's participating in this training and reviewing this, is that the utility owners, the DOT, and the highway contractors all have had a say in this utility adjustment schedule and what we're seeking to be contained within it. So the utility owners have had a voice in everything that I'm going over here today, and I think that's important to understand, as well as the highway contractors. So what are we looking for in each various phase of work as it relates to the utility adjustment schedule, section D? Typically speaking, for preliminary engineering, that should be where you as a utility owner are determining conflicts with the project. You're coordinating with other utility owners. You're proposing your new facility locations. You may be researching prior rights if you feel you're entitled to reimbursement for your relocation work. You provide markups to the department and to other utility owners if need be, as well as your relocation, completing your relocation design and all. Those are typically items that should be identified under the preliminary engineering phase. And again, I want to qualify all of these lists, including this first one that I'm mentioning. These definitions are not all-inclusive or exclusive. Every project is unique, and every project could have overlaps within this, and you'll see that here in a moment actually. However, this is just a guideline of what the department would expect to see within each phase of work. Right-of-way acquisition is fairly self-explanatory. That's where you would need time for acquisition of survey permits or right of entry on property, or even obtaining easements if necessary for your facilities if you have some that are located off the right-of-way, including fee simple title, even condemnation if necessary. This phase should just identify essentially the footprint you need in order to complete your facility relocation work. Construction engineering would be items that would occur when you're authorized to start work on a work order. If you need to develop staging plans or utility sequence operations, or completing your final relocation design. Now, we say both of these should be minimal, and that's for a reason. The reason being, if there's been no changes to the roadway plans or to other utility facilities that had adversely impacted your relocation work, then the bulk of your design work should have been performed already, and this should be just minor tweaking at this stage based on some field conditions and so forth, but they should not be any major engineering required to finalize this relocation work. Establishing a bid contract for local governments in particular, and some even private utility owners. If you plan on soliciting bids for part of the work, you'll have a time period in which you need to do that. That could be accounted for under construction engineering. Also, obtaining necessary permits. You're responsible as a utility owner for obtaining any permits necessary for the relocation of your work. If the work is not accounted for in the department's roadway plans, that could include the EPD, the Corps of Engineers, railroads, etc. So keep that in mind. You need to account for time and all in which to obtain any necessary permits for your relocation work, as well as staking. And I want to say here, just for clarification, what we're talking about with staking at this point is the layout of your relocation work. This is not right-of-way staking required of the contractor for identifying the right-of-way limits, so we all know where that location is. This is the staking of your actual facility layouts, your relocation work. You are responsible as a utility owner for staking out your facility relocations and accounting for that work. And I just wanted to clarify that here, because that question has come up several times about having the contractor stake your facility relocation work. Now, there's nothing wrong with you as a utility owner in entering into an agreement with a contractor to perform that work, but that's totally separate from the roadway project, and that's between you and the highway contractor. But it is not his responsibility to perform the stake and layout for your relocation work. So just wanted to make sure that was clear. Material procurement. This is obviously where you're requiring acquisition of materials or plant items for any of your facilities requiring relocation and or adjustments. You also need to account for fabrication and delivery time, particularly for long lead items. Several years ago, we were having issues with steel and concrete, so self-supporting poles were taking several months to almost a year at one point in time. And this is a good point to bring up. With those long lead times of that, please, by all means, discuss that with the district utility office. And if there's any way possible, what we will try to do is provide an early authorization for you to acquire those facilities, or at least order them, in order to not delay the project once it's let to contract. So those are things that you can discuss with the district utility office, make them aware of that, so we can possibly modify either the project schedule, the letting schedule, or see about doing early authorizations on some of these long lead items. Those are things that need to be discussed in part of the project coordination, ongoing coordination efforts. Clearing and trimming is simply the removal of unacceptable vegetation. This again is not something that you would expect the contractor to perform. This is work for, say, like a pole owner, where you need the additional clearance outside of right of way or so forth, for your pole line or whatever your facility may be, but because of your own requirements for vegetation removal, this may be something that you need to account for here that would not be something that's an expectation of the roadway contractor to perform this work. Construction is the installation of your new facilities, transferring of any existing facilities to the new locations, removal of existing facilities, establishing a bid contract, much like was identified in the CE phase. That's where I mentioned some of this could overlap depending on how you account for work within your own company. Or if it's in a GDOT bid item within a GDOT project. That may be something where you're doing part of the work here along with some of the work that's incorporated in the department's project. One thing I want to point out here on removal of existing facilities, please, as a utility owner, do not forget to account for removal of your existing facilities. If you're abandoning facilities, particularly above ground facilities, such as a pole, slick site, so forth, that will require removal before the project's complete, make sure you account for that time within your schedule. So you need to ensure that you've incorporated that within the time frame of your schedule, and even particularly say for a pole owner. You can't remove the poles till all the attachees are off your old poles. You may have established your new pole line and left the project at that point, but there would be a period of time when you would need to account for coming back onto the project to start removing poles. So keep that in mind. That needs to be accounted for within your schedule. Splicing or tie-in work is simply that, where you need to do final cutover, make final connections, or remove connections from the utility system, whatever it may be, underground or overhead. Any of that needs to be accounted for, and typically we would see that identified under a splicing or tie-in work phase. Service considerations, we mentioned that. You saw an example of that in the completed utility adjustment schedule sample that I showed earlier. But coordinating with railroads, if you have construction limitations, special equipment or labor availability issues, those are things that need to be accounted for. Operational or loading limitations, again, after hour or weekend work requirements. Contractual obligations to customers or regulatory constraints. Those are all items that typically should be identified under Section B, Special Requirements, as well as Section C, your detailed work plan. And you can identify those in that Section C as a service consideration phase. That would be an appropriate place to capture those kind of downtimes, basically. And keep in mind, if you don't properly account for these downtimes, the clocks will still be ticking on your schedule. So that's why it's critical for you to make sure you've captured any dependent activities that will prevent you from performing active work until such dependent activity is completed. That's why it's critical to account for those dependent activities. And of course, temporary work to accommodate the contractor or the department. Now keep in mind, this is different than temporary work requested of you maybe by the contractor at a later date once the project has been awarded and the contractor has taken over the project, whether by him or the department. Because if you recall, I mentioned earlier, you're submitting this utility adjustment schedule well in advance of a letting of a project, and certainly before award of a project. So what this, as far as if you need to do some particular utility sequence of operation or staging on your own, or whether requested by the department. We may see an example of this in, say, a bridge widening in a rural location, 2-lane road, with say an overhead power line right adjacent to the bridge, and there's not enough room to move equipment in to perform that work. So the department may request that you do a temporary box out, move away from the pole line, the bridge line with your pole line, in order to allow for construction activities to occur around the bridge. And then if the right-of-way is not sufficient for you to remain in place away from the bridge, you would have to move your pole line back in. So those would be temporary poles you had to place out to box out around the bridge. That would be the type of work you would be accounting for here typically. Now, this attachment here, these next two slides show, go over the definitions and give a little bit more of an explanation of what make up each of the various items. The language, the red text that you see in this is, again, comes from revisions, proposed revisions by the Utility Liaison Committee that we've made and are working on to finalize within GUPS and elsewhere. So that's all the significance of the red text. And there's the definitions. So we've discussed the utility adjustment schedule and getting that in to the department. Now, what I want to go over at this point is we've been in the pre-construction phase and we're getting up ready to let a project. Every dollar that the department spends on projects requires 3 certifications. There's environmental, right-of-way, and utility. All 3 of those offices have to certify a project in order to get construction funding authorized for that project. As far as utility certifications are concerned, the items that make up the requirements in order to properly certify a project is called the work plan. And that consists of 3 items: the utilities relocation plans, the utility adjustment schedule, and the GUPS permits. As I mentioned earlier, certification occurs 11 weeks prior to the department letting a project. Once those 3 certifications have occurred, the department can request funding authorization for that project. And then once funds have been authorized, we can move forward with the letting of the project. And if we have an acceptable bid on that project, we will award that project. Now, what happens if we don't have everything in place for utility certification? Hopefully, you all are aware of the URPN letters, Utility Relocation Procedure Notice. The URPN 4 letter, or better known as the Failure to Submit, or FTS, is a letter that will be sent out to you by the district utility office if there's a deliverable that you have failed to provide to the department, whatever that deliverable may be, where it is relocation plans, permit, or the utility adjustment schedule. And essentially what that FTS letter is doing, and this is in accordance with what was put in place with Senate Bill 19, and is covered in state law now. It is putting you, the utility owner, on notice that the project's moving forward. We're not going to hold up the project due to the deliverable that was requested of you not being returned. Now, a little bit on the FTS letter. The State Utility Office recommends to the districts that the FTS letter should be sent no later than a FFPR, which is Final Field Plan Review, scheduled date. If you recall, I mentioned earlier, FFPR typically is held about 6 months prior to a project letting. We need all that information in order to go to the field plan review and get to the point where we can certify a project. Now, by policy, the district utility office can submit an FTS letter to you the next day after something was due. If something was due this past Friday, come Monday morning, they can turn around and submit the FTS letter to you if that deliverable was not provided. Now, historically in the past, what the state office has recommended as a guideline, and this goes back to the relationship and true partnerships that we have and want to continue to build with the utility owners, is that if you had a deliverable that was due last Friday, but you had contacted the district office and said, hey, I need another week to get that schedule in or that set of plans in. And in the past, when that's occurred, within that week, that deliverable was provided to the department, then that's probably something we could accept, and that goes back to that relationship and partnership. And we could hold off on the FTS letter. On the flip side of that, historically, you've been late on a deliverable and told the department you needed another week or two, but 2 months later you still hadn't provided it, and this had occurred several times, then we probably go ahead and submit that FTS letter to get it documented that there's a potential for a delay to this project due to whatever reason. So just keep that in mind as we try to move forward working together as partners and building relationships. And also keep in mind that the utility owners had a say in this entire process. So y'all have been part of this process. So again, the FTS letter is a notice that the project's moving forward. We're not going to delay it due to the non-deliverable. It also makes you aware of under state law that any potential liability, financial liability of delay costs could fall on you as a utility owner. We treat a failure to submit a deliverable the same whether we're speaking of reimbursable facilities or non-reimbursable. Either way, if there's a deliverable requested with a given time frame and it's failed to be submitted, then an FTS letter could be sent out. Now, one thing that is important to understand, if you remember I mentioned earlier this morning that utility adjustment schedules are now provided to our Construction Bidding Administration Office. So the UASs are included as part of the department's bid advertisement packages. If part of the work plan, including the utility adjustment schedule, is not provided to the department, then the FTS letter that was submitted to you identifying that we did not have that utility adjustment schedule will be included as part of that department's advertisement bid package. Now, what that means is, because at that point we're having to move forward with letting this project and we don't know what your relocation schedule is, so we include that FTS letter as part of the package. So there's 11 utilities on the facilities on the project, and we have 10 UASs in that bid package, we may have one FTS letter showing that we did not get a UAS from that utility owner. What that would then mean is at the pre-construction meeting held by the contractor, once the project's been awarded, the department will recommend to the contractor to immediately begin escalation on that project for the utility owner that did not provide a utility adjustment schedule. The reason behind that is nobody, including the contractor or the department, knows what your plans or time frame is for relocating your facilities. So you failed to make the department or the contractor aware of that, and the only other alternative is to begin escalation at that point. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but what you've done by allowing it to get to that point instead of providing that utility adjustment schedule prior to the project being let is you've brought the contractor in, which, as I said, is not necessarily a bad thing, but you brought another party in on the discussion at that point, because the contractor has a responsibility then to complete that project in accordance with the department's schedule, contract time schedule. And so he therefore has a responsibility to the department, and he gets to provide comments as to how your proposed schedule may impact his work and his ability to deliver that project on time. So that's just something to keep in mind if we've gotten to that point. Now, this next slide is just an example of the URPN 4 letter or FTS letter. It essentially addresses that plans or electronic files were provided to you on such and such date. It states that you acknowledge you did receive the plans. And then it also identifies when the deliverables were due back to the department. And the middle section there has blocks, and the district will check off the items that they are still missing. Now, please, by all means, don't panic if you receive this letter. Understand that things can get lost in the mail, and it may be something as simple as when you get this letter, you see the check marks and you realize that, well, I did provide that. Pick up the phone, call the district, and discuss that with them if there's concerns over that. Or if the letter is in fact accurate, pick up the phone, or at the very least with an email, correspond with the district and make them aware that what your intentions are as to try to remedy the situation. So again, and by all means, this FTS letter, and this holds true for the department personnel as well, it is not something that the department, once they send it, they can just stick in the file and say, I'm done with that project. We still have a responsibility for the department to periodically check on the status of where you are in providing these deliverables. You as a utility owner have a responsibility to try to add additional resources or whatever may be necessary in order to complete these non-deliverables and provide them to the department, and if at all possible, well before advertisement of the project, so we can make sure and incorporate any outstanding items within the department's bid plan advertisement package. That benefits everyone in the long run. And if you notice down at the bottom, it shows that the department will continue the normal pre-construction and contract letting procedure in order to deliver this project on schedule. And at the end it says, you are hereby notified you may be responsible for delay caused to the department and its contractor. So that is critical, and that is what was addressed with the passing of Senate Bill 19 and is now codified in state law. So, and having said that, Senate Bill 19 was signed into law July 1st, 2007. The specific parts as it addressed the escalation process that it revised was sections 32.6.170 and 32.6.171 of the official code of Georgia annotated. Those are included in the items earlier, part of the handouts that I showed you earlier in this presentation. What the law did for GDOT was, as I mentioned earlier, it gave the authority for the department to participate in the utility relocation cost for a PID or public interest determination project as long as those facilities are included in the contract. That is a big item for Georgia and for the department in moving forward with our projects. Now, one thing I want to add here is even if a project does not qualify for a PID, public interest determination, for the department to pay for those relocation work, if you have facilities, even if it's non-reimbursable, we can still include that work in our roadway contract. And we would enter into what's known as a contract item agreement. And then once the bids come in, we would request payment from you for the proposed cost of that relocation work. Again, the PID, or you including your facilities in our contract, provides a couple benefits. If it's PID, the department's paying for the cost. Everything, we can pay for anything excluding betterment. But what both cases, whether it's a PID project or not, if you include the facilities in the contract, achieves for you as a utility owner, is the utility adjustment schedule basically would not apply. They essentially would not be one because the contractor's performing the work. Now, we still recommend that you do a UAS with a few days on there to account for pre-construction meeting and the various utility coordination meetings held on any given project. But as far as the actual relocation work itself, if the contractor's performing the work, then he is responsible for the schedule of that work getting complete. So that's a win-win for you as a utility owner. Now, what the state law also put into place to address for the utility, as I mentioned, the first part is the carry to the law. The second part is the stick, if you will. It essentially states that the utility may be liable to the department and or the contractor for documented damages, and the key word there is documented, and I'm going to address that here momentarily, resulting from failure on the part of the utility to comply with its work plan. So as I've mentioned a couple of times this morning, this is where the state law comes in now to address delays on our projects and determining who is responsible for that delay, holding them accountable, and them potentially being liable for any cost impacts to the delay created by that issue. Now, what it also required was for GDOT to establish procedures for a mediation board to hear and decide disputes between the department and the utility concerning 4 areas. The work plan, which as I mentioned earlier, consists of your relocation plans, your GUPS permit, and the utility adjustment schedule, a revised work plan, or the contractor's claim for delay costs, which would be on construction, and of course the last bullet there is the one to cover other items, any other matter related to the relocation of the utility facilities that does not fall in the first 3 bullets. Now, the work plan is in the pre-construction phase, and I'm going to go over that in greater detail here momentarily. And I'll also briefly address the revised work plan, which would occur obviously after the work plan is deemed to need revising for whatever reason. Also, what the law put into place was that the department shall promulgate reasonable regulations governing the mediation board, including procedural rules and a list of qualified mediators. That's covered under section OCGA 326174. And that addresses the rules and all that are covered under the manual, in which the department, the contractor, and the utility owners now are required to follow, as well as providing for a list of qualified mediators. The State Attorney General's office houses a list of qualified mediators for various topics, including this for the Department of Transportation. So that is actually an approved list of persons that are eligible to hear mediation cases and review the information and provide a remedy to the issue at hand. Now also, from Senate Bill 19, what it did was create, essentially out of that, Board Rule 672-19 was established and implemented January 1st, 2008. From that board rule, the escalation process was developed and created and is housed in Chapter 4 of the Utility Accommodation Policy and Standards Manual. I'm going to go over part of that briefly as it relates to disputes related to a work plan and a revised work plan, but it is covered in much greater detail within the Utility Accommodations Manual. Now, if you recall, some of the things I've said this morning talked about tying everything together, where we used to not have the pre-construction side, the design side of things within the department with the Utility Accommodations Manual, and then requirements for the contractor. We now have a utility conflict special provision. It's been included in every contract let since April 2009. So this has been going on for 7+ years now. What that special provision requires of the contractor is for him to follow Chapter 4 of the Utility Accommodations Policy and Standards Manual when addressing potential utility relocation delays. So now we have something tying the contractor to the utility manual, which before the utility owners were bound by the utility manual, but there was nothing tying the roadway contractor to the requirements of the manual. This special provision does that as it relates to the escalation mediation process. We also now require in our standard spec, section 107, a worksite utility coordination supervisor, better known as a WUCS. This goes on all contracts except for the most minor of projects. You as a utility owner should know this person. What the WUCS is a person that is employed by the roadway contractor, and that person is primarily responsible for managing and facilitating the utility coordination efforts on that roadway project. This person will be the one handling the utility section at the pre-construction meeting, as well as handling and facilitating the utility coordination, subsequent utility coordination meetings as a project moves forward under construction. This WUCS person is someone, as I said, you need to know who this person is, and this will be your primary point of contact and liaison between you and the contractor as it relates to the utility relocation work efforts and any concerns over a utility adjustment schedule on a given DOT project. Now, what are possible issues on our roadway projects as it relates to the escalation mediation process. As I mentioned, could have a dispute related to a utility work plan. This is in the pre-construction phase, typically. You could have a dispute related to a revised utility work plan. Again, this would be obviously if there's a change that has occurred that required modification of the approved utility work plan, including the utility adjustment schedule. A dispute related to a contractor's claim against the utility owner for delay cost or damages related to utilities removal, relocation, or adjustment of its facilities. So this bullet would represent where a contractor is claiming that the utility is delaying the project, and they have documented that. And I'm going to go into that in a little bit more detail here in a minute. But that would be a dispute that has arisen over the performance of the work as contained within the work plan, which could include the relocation plans, the permit, and or the utility adjustment schedule. And of course, the catch-all, any other matter related to removal, relocation, or adjustment of utility facilities, if the issues do not fall in one of the first three categories. So, what is an escalation or mediation process during the pre-construction phase? Again, this is a dispute regarding the work plan approval. In particular, we're talking about here today is for the utility adjustment schedule is typically where the issue might arise. Now, I will qualify this bullet with the point that we being the department are not the utility relocation experts. We understand and appreciate that you as utility owners know your facilities and your work requirements and abilities better than we do. Likewise, while we also understand that, and we've heard from many of you, that you are not roadway construction experts, that falls in the field of the department's expertise. And that goes back to that partnership and relationship where each party needs to work together to help each other understand the challenges we face in completing the requirements of our various work. Having said that, what I want to point out here about this escalation concern on a work plan approval, particularly utility adjustment schedule. Through my years working in the utility office, I personally have dealt more than one occasion with a utility owner where they had submitted a utility adjustment schedule to the department, to the district office, and I'll just throw a number out there using an example, say 300 days required for their relocation work. And of course we felt that was too long of a time. And there was pushback until the district contacted me. I contacted a person at that utility to discuss it, and in one short phone call, the schedule immediately dropped from 300 days to 150 days. And similar situations have occurred on other occasions with those kind of large gaps. My point being, what we're asking from the department for you as a utility owner is to provide us a reasonable schedule, something that we can live with, and we can also get our project completed in a timely fashion. So if something in your view needs to be 120 days and we think maybe it needs to be 100 days, should it be 120 or 100? Well, maybe the right answer is somewhere in the middle. But having said that, even that 20-day difference may not be a deal breaker for a DOT project schedule. But going from 300 days to 150 days, and yes, that is a real life example, and it is one that has occurred on more than one occasion, raises some eyebrows as to the effort that was put into that 300-day utility adjustment schedule. So my point being, please do your due diligence to build a schedule that is reasonable and that you as a utility owner can live with, but also understand that the department has a responsibility to the public to get a road back open in a timely fashion. And we need you to work with us on these schedules to ensure that our contract times are not overly extensive. So having said that, what happens if we can't come to an agreement on a utility adjustment schedule in the pre-construction phase? There'll be everyday back and forth normal coordination. The escalation would not kick in with just the normal coordination process of where you're going back and forth with the district utility office discussing appropriate times. But once it gets to a stage of where we've got to move forward with the project and we just are so far apart we can't resolve it, then at that point the district utility office will really have no option but to escalate the issue. In doing so, they will review your final submittal of that work plan or utility adjustment schedule. They'll consult with the district construction engineer and the GDOT project manager to determine reasonability as it relates to our proposed contract time and construction schedule. If the work plan or this adjustment schedule is still deemed unreasonable, then the DUE shall notify you, the utility owner, through written correspondence of that case. What will happen there once that writing occurs, that notice occurs, you will have 10 business days with which to respond to that notification with either additional justification or revision to your work plan. Now, if depending on how complex the work plan and the utilities are on that project, you, the utility owner, may request an additional coordination meeting with the district utility engineer to see if we can hash out the issues one last time. If the dispute cannot be resolved within 20 business days from that original notification that it was unacceptable, then the district utility engineer is going to escalate it to step 2. What step 2 consists of is the district utility engineer will provide a written notice to the state utility engineer that they had escalated the utility adjustment schedule issue through step 1, and they still have not been able to resolve the issue. So they're asking the state utility office to now intervene and start step 2 of the escalation process. So in step 2, the state utility engineer will schedule a project utility work plan review meeting with all the parties involved. This meeting will be held within 20 business days of written notification by the district utility engineer. At this meeting, the attendees will review the proposed design and staging plans in reference to the work plan and our adjustment schedule under dispute. Now, the parties in attendance at this meeting are going to consist of the utility owner, the district utility office, possibly the district construction office or his estimator, the project manager, and the state utility office. These parties will review everything that's submitted and will come to one of 3 primary conclusions or recommendations. 1, that the work plan as submitted is satisfactory and it will be approved by the department and we move forward. Second option would be that it's determined that the work plan or the adjustment schedule and or possibly the department's staging plan or roadway plans may need additional revisions to accommodate the project's construction. If that's the case, once such revisions are approved and accepted by the department and the utility owner, then we're ready to move forward. If we can't resolve it at that point, then the state utility engineer is going to recommend for the utility work plan issue to proceed to escalation step 3. And essentially, step 3, through all the steps, will basically proceed on to full mediation. Now, I'm not going into that in greater detail. That is addressed in the utility accommodations manual. But once we go to full mediation, keep in mind the mediation board consists of 3 members. The utility owner would pick one person, the department would pick one, and independent parties would pick the other. There is a cost involved at this point to both the department and the utility owner to convene this mediation board. It is not a free process. So there's real dollars at stake once we go to this point. So this is something we all would like to avoid if at all possible. Now, as I mentioned earlier on the work plan, the utilities, by law, the department's required to give the utilities 60 days notice. That's covered under OCGA section 32.6171 section B. Essentially, the way the department reviews that notice or provides that notice is 30 days prior to a letting. It's when the project is advertised. That's also when you will get a notice from the district with the final plan submittal and so forth. And then the additional time gets accounted for up to the contractor holding his pre-construction meeting, which typically is 3 to 5 weeks out from him being awarded the project. So they would be that notice in there to the utility owners. Now, the notice to proceed, as I said, usually occurs right around project advertisement. If you have non-reimbursable facilities, that NTP will come from the district utility office. If you have reimbursable facilities, then you will get that notice from the state utility office, typically after the project has been awarded. The letter from the district utility office will notify you of such that if you have any portion of your work occurring under a reimbursable agreement with the department, then the notice for that portion of the work will come from the state utility office at a later date. One thing to keep in mind, I mentioned earlier about getting the final plans and all, and make sure you review those against your schedule plans, but also in accordance with, if you have a reimbursable agreement, make sure when you receive your copy of that agreement and the estimate and plans that were used to enter into that agreement, compare them against the final plans and ensure that there's not been any changes that may impact your reimbursable facilities. If there are any changes that may impact that, please contact the district utility office immediately and make them aware of that. Because depending on the situation, we can easily modify that estimate and therefore that agreement to account for any changes that needed to occur, but we need to do that as quickly as possible. So again, just verify those plans that were used to develop your utility adjustment schedule, as well as your estimate for a reimbursable agreement, and ensure that if there were any revisions or anything that do not match the plans you used, bring that to the district's attention immediately. So, now we move into construction. We're getting to the contractor's pre-construction meeting. Essentially, this meeting is a notice for the utilities and railroads that are in the vicinity of the project Typically goes out from the department's area engineer and or possibly the district utility office. This will go out once the contractor has identified the date for this meeting. Depending on the complexity of the utility involvement on that project, the district utility office may determine that we should hold a separate utility pre-construction conference. This would be so we could sit down with all the utilities together and discuss the adjustment schedules and the plans and so forth, and be prepared to discuss all those at a later date at the pre-construction meeting. Please ensure that you attend this pre-construction meeting and any subsequent utility coordination meetings held on the project. And keep in mind that any person you send to these meetings should be familiar with the plans, the specs, and any utility documents as it relates to the relocation of your facilities and the roadway construction plans. Make sure they're prepared to discuss their work plan, their adjustment schedule, how that's going to fit in with what the other utility owners are proposing, as well as the contractor. So make sure the person that attends this meeting is knowledgeable enough with the materials and is prepared to discuss that if questions arise. So, kind of some little recap. Senate Bill 19 basically set in place the escalation mediation process, and it became law July 1st, 2007. Out of that, Board Rule 672-19 was created, and as a direct result of that, Chapter 4 of the Utility Manual lays out the escalation mediation process for the utility owners and for the contractor. Now, managing utilities on construction and the escalation mediation process. So what are possible issues that could be on construction? So this is at the point we've awarded the project. We've gotten through the pre-construction phase. Now we're on the construction side of things, and the contractor is in managing the project for the department. So potential issues there could be a revised utility work plan, utility damages or delay cost, again to the contractor, or the other bullet, any other item related to removal, relocation, or adjustment of the utilities facility. Items 2 and 3 follow the same process and steps with no utility coordination meeting. So, and I'm not going to get into that here since it's more on construction, and the purpose of this presentation is primarily to address the utility adjustment schedule and the impacts to it as it relates to the escalation mediation process. So, if we need a revised work plan, essentially that should only occur if there's been a previously unforeseen utility removal, relocation, or adjustment work that's found necessary after the letting of a project. The utility owner will be responsible for providing a revised work plan within 30 calendar days of this notice. This revised work plan will be reviewed by the district utility engineer, and they will probably consult with the district construction engineer as well as the area engineer's office to determine reasonability. Now that we're under construction, the department's contractor also will need to review and comment on the plan. And as a quick reminder, this goes back to what I mentioned this morning about once the contractor takes over the project, then he gets an opportunity to review and make comments on anything going forward as it relates to how it may impact his performance of his required contract time. So, If we have a revised work plan that's deemed unreasonable by the district utility office based upon the required scope of the utility adjustment or relocation required to accommodate a project, and we can't come to a resolution, then the district utility engineer is going to escalate the revised work plan issue or utility adjustment schedule to step 1. This process starts when he notifies the utility owner of that opinion in writing that the work plan or adjustment schedule is not acceptable. The utility owner will have 10 business days to respond to this notification with additional justification or with a revision to their schedule and our work plan. Depending on the complexity of the plan, the utility may request an additional coordination meeting with the district utility engineer to further explain their concerns. If we still cannot come to resolution at this point in time, within 20 days, then it will escalate to step 2. This essentially follows the same process as the work plan in the pre-construction phase as it does on the construction phase with the revised work plan. At this point, the DUE is going to notify the state utility engineer that they had escalated to step 1, but it did not resolve the dispute, and now recommend it proceed to step 2. At this point, the state utility engineer would schedule a utility work plan review meeting. That meeting is to be held within 20 business days of the written notification by the district utility engineer. At this meeting, the attendees will review the proposed design and staging plans in reference to the revised work plan under dispute. Now keep in mind at this meeting, now that we're on construction, it will include not only the department personnel, including the state and district utility offices, possibly the state and district construction offices, and the area engineer, maybe the project manager, and the utility owner, but also the contractor at this point, because the contractor will have opportunity again to review and comment on any proposed revisions to the work plan as it relates to how it may impact the project schedule. From this meeting, again, one of the following conclusions or recommendations shall be made in writing. The revised work plan is deemed satisfactory as submitted. It's approved by the department, and we all move forward. Or it may be determined that the revised work plan and or schedule or the department's plans may need additional revisions to accommodate the project construction and facilitate the utilities work plan. If that's the case, once any required revisions are approved and accepted by the department and the utility owner with the input from the contractor, then we will have an approved revised work plan and we can all move forward. If we still cannot come to some solution, then the state utility engineers will recommend that the revised work plan dispute proceed to escalation step 3, which again basically moves right into the full mediation, which I will not get into in further detail. But again, this gets to the point where none of us want to be, and we hope to resolve any outstanding issues, hopefully even prior to escalation, even step 1, but certainly by escalation step 2. Now, one thing I did want to point out, and it goes back, if you remember the slide I mentioned earlier about the contractor being able to escalate a claim against a utility for delay cost or damages related to the utility owner's failure to comply with your work plan, including your utility adjustment schedule. If you notice on this slide here, the first bullet says once the contractor determines the utility's progress is, and in bold and underline it says 20% behind its approved work plan. That is key, because what's going to happen under this third step of the escalation process, or third potential issue to create an escalation process, is the contractor and his WUCs must document the utility relocation work on a project. Part of that documentation requires his utility coordination meetings, discussions that are going on with the various utility owners, and managing their relocation work in relation to the contractor's roadway construction work. It is the contractor's responsibility, and primarily his WUCs, to document that the utility owner has fallen more than 20% behind in your approved utility adjustment schedule. At that point in time, the contractor may escalate the delay for that particular utility owner. I'm not going to get into all that in greater detail since it is on construction and it's not related to the utility adjustment schedule. But I just wanted to bring that back around to make you aware that in the past, where a contractor could say a utility owner was delaying them, and the department historically would say, well, how much time do you need? And they'd say 6 months, so we'd grant them 6 months, and that was the end of the discussion. The way the law is now, someone has to be held accountable for that delay, and potentially liable if they are cost impacted by that delay. So what this requirement achieves is the contractor has to now manage the utility, all the utilities' work plan and their progress on the projects, and ensure that he's documenting that progression, and once it gets beyond 20% behind, he can escalate at that time. Without that documentation, the department is not going to allow the contractor to escalate. So that is key there, and it's a responsibility on the contractor to manage those utilities on their project. So, kind of hit several things this morning. I know this has been a long presentation. We've covered a lot. One thing I've mentioned several times, as far as keys for success, early and thorough coordination in the PE, preliminary engineering phase, is critical to a successful project. That relationship building, that partnership building, that is all critical to a successful project. One thing I like to say in all my presentations is we're all ratepayers and we're all taxpayers. So either way, any cost are coming out of our pockets. So it benefits all of us to work together and try to have a successful project. I'm a firm believer of that, and I think that's critical to a success in this process. As a utility owner, accurately show resolution of all utility and railroad conflicts. Any impacts with our project, any conflicts that you have, make sure that you address resolving those conflicts. Coordinate with the district utility office. Make them aware of issues that you may have and concerns you may have during that pre-construction coordination phase to make sure we can do what's necessary to try to accommodate you as best as possible within the limits of our project. Utility design alternatives. Don't be afraid to bring to our attention possible alternative designs as it relates to your utility facilities, as well as our own GDOT design. The ability to design around utilities where possible, particularly early on in a process. And keep in mind, the milestones for our plans are essentially once a preliminary field plan review is held, which may be a year to 2 years out from a letting, that is essentially the milestone to get approved right-of-way plans, and then the department starts right-of-way acquisition for a project. And then, as I mentioned earlier, a final field plan review will be held approximately 6 months prior to the letting of a project. So, and that's when final design is completed for our roadway plans. So those milestones are critical in order for us to do some redesign for our project. As we get closer to a letting, it gets more and more difficult for us to accomplish any of that. So keep that in mind. Staging construction requirements. We briefly touched on that a little bit, but linear progression versus stage progression. What we want you to look at here is you may not always be able to build your facilities out in a straight line from A to B or on one side of the road. You may need to do some staging or sequence of operation for your own facility relocation work, some temporary work to help accommodate the project. That's something that we need to look at, and you need to coordinate and discuss with the district utility office to see what possibilities may exist to help us achieve a better product. Again, work with the district utility office to review concurrent activities as it relates to constructability issues. Mentioned earlier and provided as part of the handout, the responsibility for utility owners to coordinate with one another, even in the pre-construction phase, for concurrent activities, dependent activities, physical relocation areas. You know, the old saying used to be we'd put utilities in the back 5 feet of the right-of-way, but when you're talking about a 12-inch water main, a underground gas line, a underground telecom, and a pole line, that 5 feet gets filled real quick. So they may be where utilities that were on one side of the road, we may request them go to the other side of the road. Those are all part of the preliminary engineering coordination process, the pre-construction phase, and that may impact how you have to develop your relocation plan. So keep all that in mind. Ensure utilities have required plan components for each submission. This is something as a utility owner, if you're aware, when you get those plan submittals from the department, make sure you have everything you need to do an adequate design, relocation design. In other words, you need obviously the 2D plan drawings, but you need cross sections, you need drainage profiles, drainage cross section, staging plans if they are any. If you're aware of any plans, sections of plans that you feel you need to do an adequate review and design of your relocation facilities and you don't have them, please contact the district utility office immediately to ensure that we can get you the necessary sections for you to complete your work with. I've mentioned several times, build true relationships with the department and contractors. I know this may sound a little hokey, but we're all in this together, folks, and in order to have a successful project, we all have to work together. And the department, we're not just talking about one project, we're talking dozens to hundreds of projects that we all work together on. So think about that as it relates to being a true partner and working on good, positive relationships, not adversarial type relationships. I mentioned a little bit utility adjustment schedule timelines, worst case versus best case scenarios. I mentioned the 300 days getting cut down to 150 days. That certainly raises a flag about the effort put in to those utility adjustment schedules. I want to impress upon you as a utility owner that the department is not seeking to put you in a corner or be punitive in any shape, form, or fashion. But neither can we accept an absolute worst case scenario in a schedule when we are under certain constraints on our contract times. So at the same time, best case scenario for you may be something that you feel somewhat uncomfortable with. So somewhere there should be a happy medium in there, and that's what we all need to work towards and trying to develop. And that comes from that relationship and partnership building as well. No gaps between phases when dependent activity is complete. This goes back to the work plan, the section C, the detailed work plan. What we've seen in the past is there may be a gap. You may show a certain amount of work and then say from day 1 to day 30, and then the next phase of work doesn't pick up till say day 45. Well, from the department's perspective, looking at that plan, it looks like for 15 days you weren't doing anything. There was no work occurring. And that's going to raise a question. So this goes back to where maybe that 15 days was a dependent activity. You were waiting on a pole owner or whatever it may be. But you need to identify that dependent activity and then show that next activity picking up when that dependent activity is complete. So they shouldn't be a gap, an unidentified gap, but on the detailed work plan of your utility adjustment schedule. So keep that in mind when you're completing those. We kind of mentioned several times the sort of vague catch-all terms in Section B and Section C, such as clear entire project, complete all grading, etc. Again, on small projects, these terms may be completely acceptable. On larger projects, they probably will need additional clarification. That's just something that would require additional discussion. But typically on the larger projects, it's something that you may need to revamp how you go about building your relocation schedules and plans and making sure you can do part of the work as a project is phased in. Utility coordination meeting. This is something that may be held 4 weeks prior to a field plan review. It could be a preliminary or a final field plan review that the department may initiate, the district utility office. The utility owner could also initiate that. Depending on the number of utilities on a project and the complexity of the utilities on that project, it may be appropriate to have a separate coordination meeting. The district utility office will be represented at the field plan review. And what this utility coordination meeting allows for is for them to understand and have input from all the utility owners impacted by the project and be better able to participate and answer questions at a field plan review for other department personnel as it relates to the utility impacts of that project. So keep that in mind. If you get a request to attend one of these, please by all means do attend any such utility coordination meetings. Early authorizations. I touched base on that a little bit, but we can do early authorizations in any number of ways. We can do early authorizations for material procurement, for easement acquisition, for construction engineering, for even all the way up to actual physical relocation work. Depending on the particular item, there's different hoops that the department may have to jump through to make it happen, the district and the state utility offices. But if there's possibilities for that, or there's long lead times, as I mentioned earlier, particularly with material procurement and so forth, please bring that to the district's attention so they can discuss those possibilities with the state office in order to minimize any potential delays to a project once it gets underway. So those are just, again, a brief list of some things for success for all of us to work together on. And in the end, to deliver a successful project to the traveling public for the citizens of Georgia. These next few slides are just some resource information. This is the district utility engineers, their locations, phone numbers, and email addresses. Here's contacts within the state utility office if you need to contact any of those. This is a link to the Senate Bill 19 as well as the board rule 672.19. These links should still be good. This is a link to the GDOT Office of Utilities website. If you've never looked at this website, please go out there. There's a lot of good resources out there, including access to the Utility Accommodations Manual, which was also referenced in this presentation as it relates to the escalation mediation process. The Federal Program Guide for Utility Relocation and Accommodations link, CFR Code of Federal Regulations, and of course the district quarterly utility meetings. Please make sure you attend these district quarterly meetings if at all possible. One thing to keep in mind on these district quarterly utility meetings, these are as much a meeting for you, the utility owner, as it is for the department. So please, by all means, try to attend these district quarterly utility meetings and all. With that being said, that wraps up everything I had today. I hope this was beneficial to each of you. And again, if you have any questions or any concerns, please contact the state utility office or the various district utility offices, or you may even contact me directly if necessary. Thank you very much.